Well, we finally celebrate today's opening. Thank you. We thank all of the attendees for joining us in person or remotely in this 48th session of the Permanent Seminar for Welfare in Americas. It's a great joy for us, and it's an honor to open this seminar to enjoy this wonderful sequence of presentations. It's called International Instruments on Social Protection to Face New Social Risks. It's about the sequence of events of social security risks. This has been coordinated by the Inter-American Conference and the National Autonomous University. It's correlated to volume 4th of Risk in Society edition, that paper or document. So we have simultaneous interpretation services to English and Portuguese. So at the bottom of your screen, you can go to the toolbar and activate or select the language of your preference. For the opening celebration, we're going to listen to the words of the General Secretary, Velarca Hernandez, the General Secretary of the Inter-American Conference on Social Security. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Veronica. I hope you're all having a great day. Thank you for attending. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here in person or remotely following our streaming. I'd like to welcome you all. And let's commence. Let's celebrate this opening. And I also sent you the salutes of Zoe Robledo Aburto, the president and the president of Social Security entities and authorities in Mexico, and IMSS. Well, during this opportunity, we've been given the chance to celebrate this conference. We're very happy to have you present. So it's the 4th edition or the 4th volume of International Instruments on Social Protection to face in the face of new social risks. This event is going to be led by Mr. Marcos Mollar, the author of that document. And I also congratulate you all for attending and thank you for submitting your comments. We thank attorneys Milagros Betancourt and Mireya Castañeda. They're part of this event, and we salute also who coordinated this event with socio-environmental risks, Ms. Nayeli Ruiz, and we thank her technical secretary, Laura Sanchez, and Ms. Veronica Zamudio. Thank you for helping us coordinate or developing that 4th edition of that instrument in correlation to the efforts of the Inter-American Conference on Social Security. I thank Ms. Tania Forzado for joining this event representing the retirement funds or trust in Mexico called CONSAR. This 4th edition of the document is a major project that's been done in this joint effort with the Inter-American Conference in coordination with the National Autonomous University, UNAM. So this project is now material, and we've built the project with other subtopics about the protection and social security risks. For example, the previous edition was correlated, and it had in the body of the document is universal access to Social Security services amidst emergencies and disasters. And we have another document that's about the challenges in legislation and migration and climate change. Now, going to the next document or the book that we've been submitting today, this book, and I highlight the following. This joint endeavor with the Inter-American Conference led us to research, analyze what's happening with the international cooperation or partnerships, because we might analyze the dimension of the impacts and the scalability of what's happening at country level or international level or local level. We have to analyze climate change amidst disasters and the well-being of our societies amidst crisis. All of these subjects or topics require or demand the legislation that's proper, along with the right mechanisms for international authorities to coordinate their efforts. The economies cooperate geographically, and we work together politically in our societies and in our economy. So in that sense, we need to strengthen international cooperation to face climate change, its impact amidst disasters. So our economies should be aligned and in compliance with international law, with the clear objective to drive our efforts forward. We have to create a bloc in America to progress and support each other. So that's why we're going to be studying the international social protection instruments to see how we can protect our societies or citizenship amidst disasters. So in this chapter, this edition of this document, we have 3 pillars that I want to mention. First, we have to analyze the scope, the general scope, the treaties, conventions, and international law and climate change and to tackle disasters. Second point, we have to integrate social security efforts in the risk administration amidst disaster scenarios to build societies in America that are strong and resilient. third point, we have to highlight that international bodies have to work in synergy, in cooperation with the academia and others to integrate the different grounds or perspectives to tackle the risks and problems that are of common interest. So thank you all for joining. It's great to receive this book, this instrument. Thank you for going through major efforts in your teams to make this all happen. So once again, I thank you very much for being part. I hope you're having a great day. Now we'll continue with Ms. Naxeli Ruiz Rivera, who's been coordinating the university seminar about socio-environmental risks of UNAM, the National Autonomous University. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for following the streaming. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to be part of this panel. I thank the Inter-American Conference colleagues who have been of great support. You've been a great ally to draft and create this editorial instrument, this edited and worded instrument. Thank you for spreading knowledge and the word in these books regarding the risks and the social risks. Now, all of you who are following the streaming or attending this conference online or at the auditorium, well, it's an honor for us to be here submitting the document or this book. I'm not going to be thorough about the content of this instrument because we have the main keynote speakers who will take the floor at the time being to discuss that this book is very relevant. It includes in the body like social security risks. We have the national seminar about climate change and risks. And this joint endeavor has been created, or these instruments have been created because it's a need. We correlate topics that are relevant, that have an impact. We need to understand the risks and the challenges that we're all facing now in this present, but we're going to face risks in the future decades. These topics have great relevance. We have to be capable of preserving the clarity about the topics. Disasters could be avoided. We can avoid our citizenships or our population suffering. We can do things in advance so we can have the proper mechanisms as institutions to face the risks and challenges. And in this sequence of documents, we have researched and explored the content to have the basic grounds about the role that we all play in social protection. We have to cut down risk or reduce the risks that our societies face when we've been a bit worn, our societies. This document has been submitted to you all. And in this edition, the book is called International Social Protection Instruments to Face New Social Security Risks. So this is part of the context that all our economies are going through. And this gives us the grounds at an international scale, local scale, domestic scale to be matter of discussion. We have to see the points which are relevant, to have a joint cooperation analysis. We're protecting our people's rights when we speak about risk and correlation to resiliency. So these books hold great value. This document has been object of research. It's very detailed. The wording, the addition of the document of the paper has been great. We compiled a lot of tools, a lot of data that's spread in other instruments, and we compile this in this document. We have a clear vision of all the topics that exist and everything that we have at hand as a source to strengthen our social security policies, our government programs, and our actions. Without further ado, I'd like to thank you all for being part. I'd like to thank all who collaborated or contributed to create this edition or this instrument, which is now a reality. There's many researchers that have compiled the information to create this book. There's a lot of a great team of contributors, and of course, we acknowledge the Inter-American Conference on Social Security. We thank the technical editors, the authors, and the proofreading teams that were working on editing and working and on building this document, this book, which is beautiful, which has been well reviewed, and it has been object of scrutiny. It has a lot of information, objective information. It's just I feel a lot of joy for sharing and submitting this instrument. So we continue with the presentation of the aforementioned book. I thank the Inter-American Conference on Social Security. We're so thankful for your support. We thank you for creating this strategic partnership. We thank you for making this book a reality, for spreading the knowledge for decision makers and for different stakeholders that hold an interest on analyzing the dimensions of Social Security and risk. Thank you. I congratulate all the authors of the instrument of the book, and we're here paying close attention to your participations.
Muchas gracias. Esta mañana
Thank you very
contamos
much. Now, during this morning, we have invited a group of expert panel members that have a lot of to do in their journey in international law experts. We have the honor, we've had the honor to invite the author of this book, that's the attorney Marcos Medio Mollar. We thank you, Mr. Mollar, for joining us from Argentina. I know that you're following us remotely, and I will read their bios.
Marcos Mollar es
Our attorney Marcos Mollar, Nelio Mollar, he obtained his degree in law, international law, in the University of Buenos Aires, through the Catholic Argentinian University. He's a scholar, a professor in different postgrad higher studies in the Austral University also. He's been part of AUC, or the Argentinian Catholic University, and other authorities. He is a researcher at the Argentinian University. He's been studying and researching international law and other postgrad studies. And he has different programs in the field of law from the international courts, the committees of American states. He's been part of the International Commission of the United Nations and the Inter-American Center on Research on Social Security Affairs. And he's also been part of the Iberoamericana Association, ILO, amongst other bodies. Thank you, sir, very much for joining. And we also welcome Ms. Milagros de Betancourt, our doctor, Ms. Calcaño. She's the incumbent of the Institution of International Law, International Public Law in the Catholic University in Andrés Bello in Venezuela. So, ma'am, we salute you. We know you're based in Venezuela. She was an ambassador of Venezuela. She's now retired. She was the lead of international treaties and the incumbent of multilateral affairs from the Ministry of Interior or Foreign Affairs. She's been part of many negotiating tables to fight corruption. She's been working on the Rome bylaws in the International Criminal Court, and she's also been working in the Inter-American or European Declaration of International Law and Rights. She's a professor of international public law in the Catholic University Andrés Bello. Thank you, ma'am. And we also welcome Dr. Mireya Castañeda Hernandez. She's part of the Acatlan of National Autonomous University, and she's part of this conference and is in person at the Inter-American Conference. She's a professor of law, thanks to the degree she achieved in international law. And the Carlos III, or the Charles III from Spain. She studied in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and Spain, and she has her international PhD, which was given to her in 2018. She's been a professor in different public and private universities. She has been working in different fields of research and human rights research. And the National Commission of Human Rights, she worked there since 2012 till 2016, and 2020, 2022. She's also part of a group of researchers in the judiciary body of this nation. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you for joining this table. Now, before we continue, I want to salute Ms. Vanessa Storlinovsky. She's the executive researcher or a research coordinator of the Inter-American Conference on Social Security. She's here in person. And we thank Ms. Laura Sanchez de Jesus. She's part of she's the technical secretary of the seminar about social and environmental risks of UNAM. The work of these both ladies has been fundamental so we can build and draft the books that have been submitted today. Today, we submit to you all the 4th edition. Now, before we open the floor for our panel members, we will explain how we will moderate the panel. First, we're going to listen to the author, and he'll be given 15 minutes to express the content. Then we're going to listen to our Dr. Milagros. She'll have up to 20 minutes. And then we're going to listen to Dr. Mireya, and after their participations, we will open the floor and have some time, around 18 minutes for a Q&A or questions and answers, so we can listen to your feedback and comments. Without further ado, now the floor is going to be taken by Mr. Nelio Mollar, the author. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Well, I thank you. Of course, I thank the General Secretary of the Inter-American Conference on Social Security, Mr. Álvaro Velarca, the Executive Director of the Research Projects of the Inter-American Conference on Social Security Endeavors, Storlinovsky. We thank the Technical Coordinator of the Seminar on Social Security Risks of UNAM, Laura Sanchez de Jesus, Ms. Araceli Ruiz, and all who contributed and made this possible. The review process and the peer review and the proofreading and addition of the body of this document, we thank Ms. Samudio. I thank you for inviting me to draft and be the author of this document that's been submitted to you all. And of course, I thank the prestigious panel members that are part of this event. Thank you for accepting the invite so we can comment and express our feedbacks and observations regarding this work. When I was called to be the author of these instruments, I was amidst the last stages of COVID-19. We all faced and witnessed the challenges that COVID-19 left. Amidst the pandemic, we had to work with the social security institutions and their beneficiaries amidst that time frame. A few years ago, social security rights and access to those rights, well, were there to protect the citizens in all their lifespan from the moment they were born till their death. To face amidst this, social security is something that's used to protect our people during their agings, to face health conditions, accidents at the workplace, invalidity or disabilities, and other topics. Currently, the content or the focus of Social Security has broadened its scope of topics. We have incorporated to the list other subjects that are part of analysis amidst a contingency. So there's new risks in our societies, such as the new risks are correlated to the platform development, the exploitation of natural resources, economic crisis, and all of these new risks that are always present. The increase of poverty is a challenge, the increase of our anxiety in our population, the aging population, migration is a crisis, and of course, climate change is another risk or topic. There's other situations such as disasters in our economies. This last risk is something that was part of the body of this document or this instrument. We analyze the natural phenomenon, disasters, and the correlatable risks. So our societies are always facing these challenges or disasters as in the collective and as individuals, and it's even more intense now. These natural phenomenons or acts of God have the capacity to really produce negative impacts or outputs in our societies. They impact negatively the assets, our people, their environment that are a major threat. If you add that to all the conditions of vulnerability in our people, in our citizens, we think about how the bodies are affected and how societies are affected. That's leading us to disaster. So we've heard about the concept of natural disasters, acts of God. But I mean, you see, it's the phenomenon in nature that generates the disaster. So, as has been mentioned by Ms. Araceli Ruiz before me, so these natural phenomenons or these disasters are unavoidable, like an earthquake, an eruption, a volcano, or tsunamis. Natural disasters could be avoided or could be mitigated in some cases. However, if we analyze the vulnerability conditions of our individuals, our collective, our societies, and our institutions, the conditions of vulnerability lead us to speak about the economics, social, economical, technological, environmental risks. Even the legislation is part of it because we have to have the resources available to face any situation of these threats or phenomenons. And specifically, if we analyze the risks that the elders are suffering, the elders are exposed to these dangers and hazards or grievances, and their conditions of vulnerability could even be greater. They might have a lack of wage, a lack of access, a lack of documentation. If there's a natural disaster, they might lose their IDs. They can't probably recover their households amidst a disaster and other contingencies. Socioeconomic environmental contingencies generate a major context that can impact the capacity that we all have to be resilient, that our people have, that our institutions have. I mean, we need to have the capacity or the skill sets to protect or the mechanisms to recover amidst these type of situations. So this is when Social Security kicks in, and it plays a crucial role because with these bodies, we can face contingencies and protect our societies. We have to think about the economic transference, the services that are offered to recover our people or our citizens amidst the threats or phenomena. Today, social security mechanisms or systems have not been systematically adapting to the contingencies or these new challenges that are the outputs of social risks. So I consider that this chapter or these document can really strengthen the capacity that our bodies or institutions have above governance at an international or institutional level. We have to strengthen our social security bodies and cooperate at an international and regional scale. Social security is basic in its role to satisfy the needs of the citizens amidst the whole context, to reduce the vulnerability, to face the phenomenons with resiliency. So why we created this book with a clear objective. We need to analyze and sort out the content of the document so we can really acknowledge and comprehend what the provisions are that are useful, so we can ensure that our people, our elderly, are protected amidst a disaster. We have to give our elders that element of resiliency in our societies as a whole, that resiliency. We can adopt national policies, provisions, and build laws and regulations internally to protect our people and provide them social security services. In another chapters, we have different international treaties and conventions, the human rights instruments and treaties, social security instruments, and the correlatable international instruments amidst a challenging disaster situation. We have international treaties, conventions, or legislation that constitute and create binding relations. There's other instruments that are not binding. There's other resolutions, case law, guidelines, and recommendations. There's other instruments that are not legally binding to other economies, but they've been submitted and passed as recommended under bona fide or good faith for countries, so they can be studied, which are relevant for international law. These other instruments are the backgrounds, are the grounds from the past, to build other international instruments. We have to consolidate and use international instruments and legislate at a local domestic level in all our economies. We work with other international bodies for this purpose at an international scale. I'll tell you that different international bodies amidst these, ILO, the International Labor Organization, and others have adopted international instruments, guidelines, or other laws to facilitate this to other economies or countries so they can implement or ratify and protect their people with the systematic protection of laws for it all to be sustainable and systematically done. The social security authorities like CISS have been involved, and the Inter-American Conference have adopted international instruments or provisions to build our people's resiliency and the bodies or the social security bodies' resilience. There's the International Protocol for Disasters that have been drafted by the Inter-American Conference on Social Security back in 2022. Both of these instruments are correlatable to the Sendai authorities, to other bodies, so we can all, as economies, face risks of disasters. By 2015, we have that legislation, so we can all participate and use these protocols to protect our people and offer Social Security protection amidst disaster scenarios. As the General Secretary just mentioned, we must be active and participate actively at an international and national scale. We have to work with other international bodies and analyze the phases or stages of social security and the disasters and to reduce the impact of these phenomena. For example, we can all work with the international platforms and other bodies so we can reduce the risks and analyze or calculate the risks amongst all its phases or stages. We have to adopt the proper programs and protocols to protect their citizens in all the phases amidst the disaster. We have the protection and mitigation mechanisms to prevent and detect the disasters from happening so we can rebuild our economies or our nations. And we analyze the post-disaster phases of a disaster. And I want all your observations and feedbacks and more of your comments. I hope that this document is useful for Social Security authorities and other bodies and the rest of government officials and the other bodies that constitute Social Security authorities, the bodies and other ally stakeholders that have a clear interest on creating public policies to protect our citizens amidst a scenario of disaster.
Muchas gracias, Marcos.
Thank you very much, Marcos. Thank you for your comments, sir.
A este fascículo.
Thank you for explaining the content of the document. You're the author of this fourth edition. So now we're going to listen to Ms. Milagros Betancourt, her feedback about it. Could you please help me sharing? I need to share my screen. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor. It's a pleasure for me to have been invited to appear. I thank the authorities that have organized this event, the panel members, and those who are in person or following the streaming remotely. I thank you all. But first of all, I'd like to thank the Inter-American Conference and the Inter-American Apparatus and Social Security, the authorities, the General Secretary, and the Executive Secretary, Ms. Veronica Zamudio. Ma'am, thank you for inviting me to be part of this permanent seminar for the welfare of the Americas and social risks. We thank you. I thank you for convoking me to be part of this international seminar to discuss the document that's the International Instruments on Social Security to Face Society's Risks, which is a set of documents of books that have been published and spread. This is the fourth edition. It's about risks and society. And I must confess that when I was contacted by the authorities and I read this book, I thought that this instrument was very interesting. It contributes with objective data. The topics that are the object of the instrument are part of what we analyzed, and I'll comment. I must express Ms. Nelio Mollar, the author of the book. Sir, I congratulate you for your great work, and I'd like to highlight the following. I think the analysis was very systematic, well-structured. The wording, the text, the syntax was great. It was easy to read, easy for the reader to identify the international instruments that are correlated in the document that's object of the analysis. It's been beautifully done. It shares that general landscape, the broad context that allows us to really place ourselves in the book and understand the legislation, the norms, the international standards that are correlated to the core subject of the content. Our society's vulnerability and the section of the elders in risk situations are a chapter that demands our attention. They're a priority. Our economies, our nations have them as a priority in the collective, in our society. So this book is a great contribution for drafting and adopting and legislating provisions, your laws. The government can adopt this book as a reference to legislate. Now, in the chapter about the elderly, taking care of the elderly, we have the specific conditions of the elderly and the characterization of what we live in the latter stages of life. So the governments or states have to pay close attention of them when there's natural disasters of phenomenons that pose risk. The rights of access to Social Security is part of dignifying the humanity. And amidst phenomenons, it plays major relevance. That protection should be guaranteed by governments, by the states. Now, and I want to highlight what the author wrote in one of the chapters of the book. In one of the chapters, he mentions the general scope of Social Security and the clear focus of what we should do to protect our people and offer Social Security. And I quote, now here in that chapter, we have contingency mechanisms to face new social risks, like there's new technological scientific developments, exploitation of natural resources, and other challenges about the demographics of our populations, the density of the population, and the recurrent crisis, poverty, lack of equality, and the marginalization. He touches other points as the author, migration as a crisis, climate change as a crisis, and disaster situations as a phenomenon. So the economic and socio-economical, technological, and institutional and environmental conditions are elements, whether we like it or not, that, sometimes are the conditional. So we have to protect our people with Social Security benefits so we can face those threats amidst the disasters and phenomenon. So my following comment is correlated to crisis scenarios, risk scenarios. And I'll mention this. There's some points that are not part of the book as is in the instrument or the document, but I understand that is My comment is correlated to the implementation of international instruments amidst precarious situations, lack of rule of law, challenges amidst disaster. There's certain restrictions amidst the context, and there's human rights being violated also in general. And, our governments do not comply with their mandates, obligations, and the governments do not protect their citizens and offer social security benefits nor take care of their elderly. We're speaking about the protection of their societies in general, but there's a reduction. There's a clear or evident reduction, or pardon, there's an increase of invulnerability of our people. Our people are more vulnerable, our societies are more vulnerable. So I think that it's necessary for us to use the international instruments that have been mentioned in this document, that are written to detail and mentioned to detail, to really protect our citizens or our people with this. So our societies with these instruments. So I want to reference some of the chapters of the document. Now, I went through an assessment of the conceptual content. I'll go to the chapter of international instruments. And I know that there's certain observations of the author of the book about the binding international instruments or the soft law. There's the hard law or the soft law, and he referenced that law verbally. And some instruments or soft law are submitted to countries as a recommendation, but it's not like mandatory. There's a process in legislation, and these instruments on their bona fide or good faith. Some countries have adopted or accepted the recommendations, but it's undeniable that these international instruments are object of interpretation. And we see that on our day-to-day exercise of law or enforcement of law, as the author already mentioned in his opening announcements. Throughout the document, we can have the list of international binding instruments or the binding instruments there, and the relevance they have in the body of law and the protection of human rights, social security amidst disaster. So in those other international instruments, we have the worded text. This book, the author just mentioned a moment ago that we have the international declarations, case law, resolutions, sentences, international rulings, guidelines, and mechanisms. And the Sendai law from 2015, 2018, that was the United Nations sentence or resolution judgment, or the 102 recommendation from ILO. In these instruments, we know that we can create robust norms which are of great relevance. And I want to also comment in correlation to the international instruments in the chapter of human rights. I mean, it's crystal clear for us that the author worded and correlated these international instruments to the binding body of law and its nature. I want to go back to the America's international instruments, or the international instruments of the America. There's the International America's Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted on April 30th of 48. And that declaration was created previously to the International Declaration of Rights, which was adopted or ratified on the 10th of December of that same year. And this other international instruments, that was the American Declaration. And that American Declaration, in the spirit of the law, in the 16th article, we have enshrined the Social Security law, which is international. Here in this hemisphere, we in America, we started drafting the laws and regulations or legislation to protect our human rights, which is now part of the international instruments. Now, I must mention the Inter-American Convention about the protection of human rights of our elders that dates back to 2015. This international instrument quotes, or in the body of law, in the spirit, what's enshrined. And this, the author of the present book highlights the relevance of that international instrument. And I want to quote the author's words. He mentioned that in this international convention for the elderly, in the body of law, we have the broad understanding and inclusion of the elderly with a perspective of human rights, and we acknowledge social security access for the elderly. And as the author of the book clearly mentions, it's the only international treaty that's enforceable that considers and contemplates a chapter for protecting the elderly who are facing risks amidst disaster and humanitarian disaster. In Article 29 of that convention or international instruments, the ratifying countries will have to execute all the measures and protocols in place to guarantee that the protection of the integrity of the people is in effect. For the elderly specifically, amidst armed conflict, humanitarian emergencies, and amidst disasters in compliance to the binding international instruments. Specifically, he mentions the international instruments to protect human rights and humanitarian law. So I must highlight also that in Article 29 of that law, in the spirit of that law, in that text, we have the section of the implementation of the enforcement of this convention when there's humanitarian crisis, which I already mentioned in my initial announcements. And I highlight this Article 29 because we have to think on answering the how to tackle a situation when there's a humanitarian crisis. How are we're binded, but we have to comply with our mandate that the economies have. So we have to protect our people's social security rights. And in that document, it's clear because it was signed up by the committee or the council. We have the chapter in that international instruments about the social security rights. In 2008, we have the respect compliance. We have to respect, comply as the international instrument states, because amidst an humanitarian crisis or precarious rule of law, those instruments can, or the international binding instruments lead us to demand and comply with our obligations. But it's like the first obligation is to respect social security in these international instruments. So the governments have to participate directly or indirectly to protect and create a rule of law and protect their citizens. And in this international law, we have the establishment of law, the best practices. There should not be a denial or restriction under the principle of equality for social security access to our people. So we know that when the rule of law is frail, when precariousness is an issue, when we have to guarantee our citizens human rights, it's very difficult for the governments to comply with their mandates or obligations because it's complicated. It's complicated for the governments to guarantee their mandates or obligations. Then we have the obligation to protect. Governments should protect or also somehow administrate law to those who are not enabling social security to be the umbrella of protection under the rule of law and the authority of the state. Another point, these documents must adopt the proper measures to establish a social security system that leads them to fulfill their mandate and protect their population and provide social security. And the other segment of the instrument or the document in the chapter of Social Security, I want to mention that the ILO, the International Labor Organization, is a great source of international instruments, the Declaration of Philadelphia, and all the guidelines and international instruments that are part of different resolutions. I mean, all of these instruments are relevant, as the author of the book mentions. We have to adopt these instruments in a tripartite administration. We have to work with employers, employees, government, and these are generating best practices so countries can have data of reference of how to adopt these instruments to protect their societies and their scalability. So I'd like to highlight the fact that it's important to analyze the document, the 102 ILO instrument, that declaration amongst the new challenges or risks of social security under frail conditions of our states. And I correlate this to the chapter Rule of Law amidst conflict and disasters, where our society's protection or social protection should play a crucial role. The planet, as we know, is facing a variety of realities, so it's necessary for us to raise awareness and mindfulness in governments and states, because these binding instruments are something that we have to analyze thoroughly as a matter or the cause, which is fundamental. As far as the international instruments go, in the chapter of disasters, I have to highlight that there's the regional international instruments for the Americas. There's agreements and covenants of the Caribbean states or CARICOM community to cooperate and tackle natural disasters. That instrument dates back to 99. Another disaster protocol has been mentioned that has been drafted by the Inter-American System and the conference. The author of the book mentions this Inter-American instrument, which is international, that's been part of what I want to comment about. And I want to highlight that in the listed instruments, the author, based on his research, he analyzed bilateral treaties or agreements that exist to tackle the situations amidst risk and disaster. The listed instruments have all been ratified or adopted in countries of America. So I believe that it's extremely important for us to highlight and mention the role that these have. International and regional international law plays a crucial role at an international universal law level. I must mention that the content of the book was very interesting. There's a glossary. Included in that document. It's been beautiful. It was created in such a way that enables the reader and to enjoy the book. And it enables us to understand and comprehend the rest of the document with a glossary. And I want to comment as a conclusion that the document that has been submitted to me is excellent. The wording, wonderful. I thank and congratulate the author and all the people that participated in wording this book. It has all the clear objectives or the objective data, a comprehensive analysis of the international laws, and it's so useful so we can all protect the elderly amidst a condition of disaster after a qualitative descriptive analysis that's object of interpretation as international law is. So thank you all very much.
Muchas gracias a la doctora Milagros
We thank
Betancourt.
Dr. Milagros Betancourt for your comments, ma'am. Thank you for your feedback. We're going to listen now to Dr. Mireya Castañeda Hernández. Hello, everyone. It's an honor for me to share this morning with you all as part of this efforts of the Inter-American Conference on Social Security. Without doubt, it's an honor for us to be capable of having this table to discuss these chapters, this edition, this robust book in such a beautiful venue. It's an honor for us to have had the opportunity to hear the author and the objective feedback of the doctor who took the floor prior to me. Without doubt, this book has been beautifully worded in its scope. It sketches out real problems that our communities, the international communities, are facing. The challenges or risks are social security amidst moments of social security risks and disasters and challenges. In the book, in this instrument, we have a specific proposal. The submitted instrument has well orchestrated. The preamble or the initial chapter has a list of international instruments. There's a list of international treaties. The author of this book submits to us all soft law. This set of instruments, there are international instruments that are not binding, that are not a mandate, but this soft law can help us understand the challenges. And they're also mentioned at the end of the book. The author, without doubt, sketched out and incorporated all the data in correlation to the international instruments and treaties of human law or human rights. These instruments play a crucial role to protect labor law, our workers, and social security. So in general, we see the list of the inter-American instruments, the inter-American international instruments that the previous doctor just mentioned, and the international or United Nations international instruments. They also mentioned the birth of international binding instruments. They reference other instruments which are added. So this list of treaties incorporate the social, economical, and cultural rights. We have the Universal Declaration of the United Nations and the Protection of Human Rights. So we have this incorporation of new economic, social, economical rights there. So without doubt, social security is a topic that has been added or incorporated, very important in America as a whole, as it's been expressed previously, as Ms. Betancourt mentioned before me. So we have the Inter-American Declaration of the Rights of People, and we incorporate other Social Security international instruments. So what I want us all to understand and have present and clear is the way in which this book is worded, and the fact is it references the international treaties. In 66, the United Nations had the Inter-American Pact of Social, Economical, and Cultural Rights. What's enshrined in that international instrument is the labor rights and social security. So I must also mention, as part of my feedback, that these instruments are harmonized and function in parallel. So in 88, we've obtained the added protocol of the Inter-American Convention of Human Rights, in which we also included the Social Security rights. Without doubt, these international instruments that are part of this book have a common language at an international scale, and it's that language for us, the in America. So I'll pause just a second now that I have like the floor. I'll tell you that in Mexico we have the charter, or the 1917 Constitution. In our constitutional article 123, we acknowledge this type of rights in our constitution. 123 is part of the body of law. In its pioneer stages, we have labor rights and the access to social security in our constitution. So I would like to mention and give you a pause. First, implicitly here we have the chapter of social security rights, as I said. So we must protect our workforce. Now, having a clear vision about gender equality, women, hardworking women as well. And here, in this analysis, we try to offer the workforce, the vulnerable workforce. I know we must have the workforce always present, but we have to provide the workforce social security protection, as well as the users, beneficiaries, and relatives. And this really impacts the performance of government, the state, the workforce. If you think about the workforce situation amidst disaster, or in other conditions and phenomena, or women are also considered when they're pregnant, and there's retirement also being object of the study. At an international scale, the author of the book has described and sketched out in the chapter the following information. He specified that there's a specific committee that analyzes the social, economical, cultural rights. And that committee at an international scale is a body that can interpret law and the socioeconomic cultural rights of the people. And that it makes reference, or the author makes reference to social security. Amidst the works of that constituted or composed committee that studies economic, socio-cultural rights, they have to approve or pass certain instruments that happened back in 2008 about the International Protocol and the International Declaration of Socio-Economical Cultural Rights that empowers this committee to interpret that law and issue its communications. It has a spirit of protection, and only 26 nations have ratified it. So that committee has gone through its process of observations and analysis, as the author of the book mentioned. So we not only discuss and debate social security affairs, and this committee has also opened itself to analyze vulnerable groups. There's a chapter in the document in which there's the rights for the elderly, specifically elder women, and their socioeconomical cultural rights. So the work of this steering committee, or this committee, composed committee, helps us analyze these matters at an international scale and at an inter-American scale, so we can really understand these rights. So I would also like to recap or succinctly express that without doubt, social security has been a great achievement. And it's been part of a process of declarations. It has strengthened the planet. We acknowledge these international instruments and declarations to safekeep and protect workers or the workforce amidst emergency situations, as well as we must protect them in their and protect the aging population. I mean, human rights, without doubt, these are groups that suffer great vulnerability and should be a priority. And I believe that if we analyze Social Security, it would be worth our while to give us this document, this book, a read and analyze and interpret the sense or the spirit of it. We must protect the workforce, males and females, and their relatives amidst a condition of vulnerability. So that's why it's so important for us to strengthen social security mechanisms. Without doubt, the author who worded this book, I mean, the instrument is so robust. The author takes us to an analysis of the international instruments, other binding instruments, and other guidelines or mandates. So he leads us to read the knowledge that they bear in the field of human rights, social security, and its sections. So the author references many instruments in correlation to protocols for disaster, as the author already said during his initial announcements. So this chapter was drafted precisely keeping in mind the present or the pandemic conditions. Amidst the pandemic, Social Security played a crucial role because it was an emergency. It was a health emergency for all. So without doubt, the pandemic had a major impact. So this book is correlated to health, vulnerability, and it's also part of the present analysis. So in that sense, we have to be very mindful and really document all these international instruments and all this book, that's object of our today's scrutiny. So there's risks that our societies will face amidst emergencies. And amidst these emergencies, we have to be capable of protecting our people's human rights, specifically Social Security. So I'll allow myself now to also mention a couple of extra documents. First, let's all remember precisely Joel Hernandez. Joel Hernandez was part of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and Mr. Hernandez followed a mandate of guidelines amidst the pandemic context and how to protect our people's or our society's human rights. And so amidst that time frame, we can correlate this chapter in this book to that past to strengthen our debate or discussion in Social Security now. So let me start making my closure comments. In I mean, our appointed task today of observations and feedback in the specific chapter that I've read here has been beautifully drafted. So we have to harmonize international instruments, correlate them to human rights instruments and other laws in correlation to risks and challenges in our societies. So all of this correlation amidst the pandemic is something that proves to us all that in a situation of risk or emergency, what we went through was very delicate. So I think it would be worth our while as readers to analyze these instruments to reach a higher level of precision and understanding for us all. Precisely. I mean, if you're decision makers, you can go through a decision making process amidst an emergency, but with these grounds. So I would like to comment about another document. Joel Hernandez, when appointed in the conference, these subjects are so relevant. So we should continue expressing our feedback or observations. We've been convoked to appear during this morning's session precisely to analyze the 2030 Declaration about Sustainable Development, sourced from the United Nations, passed and ratified in 2015. Without doubt, it clearly outlines and enshrines sustainable objectives, or those goals, which are clearly correlatable to social security in this book. It's the Millennium Objectives that's correlated to the chapter of health, and the Millennium Goal that's correlated to work and the workforce, and the social development. These instruments in correlation or in harmony can guide us to, first of all, really be capable of considering the objectives of the 2030 agenda and the Millennium Goals. All of our planet or the countries involved have clear objectives and missions. Without doubt, these instruments are correlated to social security, but can also give us some room, some leeway to really analyze social security as a global priority, as the Millennium Objectives have from the United Nations. We have to comply by 2030. So in correlation to the previous panel's comments, I want to comment regarding that glossary of reference, because in that glossary we have the language of disaster management protocols there. So that glossary is robust. The chapter or this document has led this conference to happen today. And without doubt, the author of this book went through a major exercise, personal analysis in correlation to his works. I think that this book leads us to be very mindful. We have a lot of work to do. So we have the Millennium Goals, or the sustainable goals for by 2030. And without further ado, what I must say is I congratulate the author of this edition, and I thank you all for coordinating this event. Thank you all for allowing us to be part of this analysis of the book, of this edition, of the works of the author. We thank you for inviting us so we can spread the knowledge and share the additional ideas that it bears. So we need to drive development forward with a touch of mindfulness. And the author of the book in question really leads us to achieve that. Thank you all very much. We thank Dr. Mireya Castañeda for your comments, ma'am. We thank each of the panel members for their feedback, observations, for their contributions. So this book is now available. You can find it online. It's been uploaded. And at some point, we will have a quick reference code, a QR code. You can download the works of this author. And we have other links of reference that you can also access. You can download that reference data, and you can there we go. That's precisely the QR code and the links that you have. So we have some time. We have sufficient time to listen to the author's comments and observations regarding the analysis of Dr. Mireya in Milagros regarding his work. Now, I want to also use this opportunity to get observations, feedback from those who are in person or following the streaming remotely. If you have comments, questions, feedback, whether in person or remotely, right now is the time to submit your comments, questions, or observations. So we can begin. We will receive a specific feedback or comments now from the author of this book. Thank you, Mr. Nelio Marcos Moya. Thank you very much, Veronica. We thank all the expert panel members. Thank you for your kind observations, your feedback. Thank you for your scrutiny, for your analysis. Your comments have been, you've enriched my analysis, but I share what Ms. Milagros Betancourt said in correlation to humanitarian crisis. What Ms. Betancourt said about the rule of law amidst this conditions, amidst a disaster. Governments face complex scenarios in disaster, so we need to tackle the situations in a very specific way. I know that in the present is difficult to analyze a condition of disaster in correlation to disasters due to nature or disasters provoked by our people. If we see or analyze disaster, it's like an accumulation of factors that create disaster. And we correlate this to other factors of vulnerability of our citizens, which can really have an impact. We have individual societies impact amidst humanitarian crisis. We might have faced other disaster situations that are even higher in their grievances because there's other situations such as migration, displacements, refugees, and they're migrating amidst disaster. Environmental conditions also have an impact. And all of these collateral factors make our citizens or populations displace themselves in their exodus, massive exodus of people from one region to another. They cross borders if there's a disaster. You see another chapter, I think it's chapter 2. It's a very short, succinct chapter, but you have the solid content. But that unveils another complex list of topics that are matter of our debate and our analysis. So we have to be prepared amidst the situations that are in the wording. So, and I also thank Ms. Castañeda. Thank you so much for your comments, for your feedback. And I know that your comments, and you've already mentioned the current objectives or sustainable objectives or the current agenda. We have all our regional agenda, the international goals or objectives, and we have to really center ourselves on doing what we must all do so we can avoid having future headaches. So by doing things now, we can try to avoid extreme vulnerable conditions and extreme conditions. We know that our institutions have their responsibilities and liabilities, but civil society as a stakeholder and government authorities have this like joint responsibility. We're all here to try to broaden the spectrum of social security, and I thank the authorities that have made this event possible. I thank you for coordinating this wonderful panel. Thank you for the event, and I thank all the attendees for being part of it.
Muchas gracias, Marcos.
Thank you, Marcos.
Bueno, quisiera comentar que
Now, I'd like to comment precisely that this work, this book, as it's been mentioned from the beginning, in the celebration, opening celebration of this panel, in its chapters, in correlation to the chapters, we wanted to share this document with the rest of the text so we can really have a friendlier approach with the reader by the author. So we know that the semantics or the syntax and the analysis of international instruments lead us to be very specific. And here we've invited 3 expert panel members, examiners in their fields of international instruments. So these topics or books have been submitted in correlation to the analysis of crisis situations, humanitarian crisis, or disasters. So the author of the book was not necessarily an expert or a scholar in this field. However, in that sense, I think that the general objective of this book has been achieved. I thank you all panel members for expressing your comments, your feedbacks. And you as the author, sir, I thank you for drafting this book because your book it opens it for different types of readers. It's reader friendly. And we want to spread this knowledge and make this book easy to process or digest. So I want to formulate a few questions. So you as the author and the panel members, I want to ask you a few questions so all of the involved can broaden the knowledge about the international instruments that are already listed in your book, sir. So all your comments, I want to ask you, how is like a nation's legislation, how can the legislation of a country can use international instruments to benefit its levels of protection and social security, even if international instruments are soft law and not binding? And in that same sense, why are international instruments that are not binding can really enable us to generate the norm or draft the national norms, even if they're not binding or a mandate? Whoever wants to take the floor, Marcus, panel members. Milagros. Milagros, please go ahead, ma'am. Thank you, Veronica. My comments are in my initial observations or participation. It's so valuable. This book is, or the non-binding or soft law instruments are fundamental because they've been drafted or worded in the international law. What's enshrined are the international morals, the globe's or planet's morals. And what binds a government to these instruments are bona fide, under good faith, nation's morals and guiding principles. What's enshrined, because 90% of these instruments have been worded thanks to other international instruments that have been adopted, that have been ratified by economies or states. Now, I know that there's some, I mean, the morals of a government are not, can't go against this because these instruments nurture other agreements, or in some countries might not decide to incorporate this international laws as binding, but and the core, the principles of law, it is binding, even if it's not. So we're there, and there some are drafted to protect human rights, and I also mentioned the democratic instrument of the inter-American authorities. It's not an international treaty. It was adopted as a part of the resolution of the American States session. I mean, and that international declaration has provisions, laws, parameters established in the body of the Inter-American letter, that instrument that guides and legitimates by origin the execution and the performance of governments. I mean, these instruments are leading us to set the example of reference. So as a country adopting the international instruments of ILO, instruments of United Nations, under that umbrella of human rights, the governments should also nurture their law or make a robust law based on those international instruments that they have ratified, and take it in the spirit to their national legislations. For example, in Venezuela, what's enshrined in our charter, in our constitution that dates back to 99, in that body of law, in our constitution, we detail social security. It's all, it's our constitution, our charter is inspired in these international guidelines or principles that are not binding, but the government in bona fide and good faith and morals should not violate nor impede. That's my comment.
Milagros.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Milagros. Mireya, please go ahead. Yes, well, in correlation to the mentioned instruments, the instruments mentioned by the author in chapter 2, international instruments there, they're known as, some are soft law, or like these soft law instruments could be, I'll mention a few. First of all, there's some countries such as Spain, Colombia, Argentina, that in their charters, in their constitutions, they reference documents which are soft law, like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. That declaration is used as reference in Mexico. The Mexican government has a pro person principle, and its object of interpretation, it's in chapter article 1 of our charter or our law. So we can also use or read these international instruments which are object of interpretation. Now, what calls us here today as matter of study is Social Security. So Social Security is a subject of analysis of the committee constituted to analyze social, economic, cultural rights. This committee and this law is sourced from the binding treaty or pact that empowers or has a mandate in bylaws for that constituted or composed committee, and it follows specific treaties. And that composed committee has to watch over and monitor the compliance of that international law or treaty. The powers or mandates of that composed committee has to issue general recommendations or judgments. That committee has a task or a mandate, as well as other international United Nations composed committees. That committee has to read and interpret the law and issue specific recommendations as it's been resolved by that committee. That committee has to help the ratifying member states, those who ratified the international law. It's hard law, it's binding. So if the general observations regarding this, we have to think about how to enforce or implement the laws that are enshrined in that pact, in that treaty. Without doubt, that body has done its work because during this afternoon, that Committee of Social Security Economic Analysis, I mean, it's relevant. They have to analyze in their commissions other rights that are part of what we analyze at an international and state level in correlation to Social Security. Of course, we have to analyze the charters of different economies or the supreme law in like these bodies or the composed committees are the maximum authorities that can interpret the international treaties. So these international soft law instruments are correlated to the composed commission's recommendations. Their objective is to give guidance to the enforcement of these international instruments. However, it's extremely important. The author of this book, in a specific chapter, without doubt, has a rapporteurship about a soft law document list that's not binding that can be implemented to protect our people's social security and to measure risks and disasters. The purpose or the spirit of these instruments is, I know that some soft law instruments, they're not binding, but these soft law instruments have in their content specific analysis of specific subjects. For legislations in the Millennium Objectives or the 2030 Objectives and the Clear Sustainable Agenda references these documents for public administration and public governments to go through them. Without doubt, these instruments or soft law can lead us to properly implement other topics or other laws. Now, thank you very much, Mireya. Marcos, the floor is yours, sir. Thank you very much. You know, I've just heard your feedback and I adhere myself to your comments. Yeah, I approve, but I would say that I would add, I mean, you've mentioned these instruments, these international instruments are there to facilitate the implementation and efficacy that we have to protect our people's or our citizenship social security rights because governments are ratifying and they're committed and binding. They have their laws, legislations, they have their yearly government budgeting. And the countries involved, I mean, you adopt or ratify a binding international instrument, you adopt a treaty, it's not easy to ratify and pass. I mean, when there's subjects that are lead us to be sensitive and you think about budgeting, some governments have not approved nor ratified and they have not engaged themselves and accept the fact that a treaty is compulsory in its international law. Some countries have adopted some international instruments, but they have not enforced them because it's not easy to enforce these instruments and make it binding for countries. So the adoption of soft law or non-binding international instruments are the path or are the adequate path to reach that common goal or objective in a different time frame or in a different horizon. Maybe passing or ratifying others it will take other countries longer. But our panel members said, as our panel members said, these soft laws or instruments, in bona fide or good morals and principles are guided by these instruments that facilitate countries to analyze or scrutinize other subtopics. In many of the cases, each nation has its legislation and they correlate and bind them to other international instruments that have been drafted and debated and lobbied at an international scale and adopt them at a domestic level. And with this analysis, that can allow countries or enable countries to think about enforcing and adapting and adopting international instruments and treaties. And there is a path for that. And some countries have done this internally. Okay, thank you very much, Marcos. There's a question. And while this question is referenced to another chapter of your book that's about social security and its protection. So specifically, the protection of people in vulnerable conditions, such as the elderly. We've been asked, what happens when the country or a nation is facing a guerrilla, some sort of crisis, or is it considered a humanitarian crisis if the country is war-ridden? I mean, it's like this question is formulated in this body of the question is, do you have any international instruments that in its body it enshrines that data? about the gorilla. Yes, of course, in international public law, right, we have the humanitarian chapters to avoid armed conflict with international law or without that international law. We want to avoid armed conflict and guerrilla that could even be worsened by a disaster. If you have a guerrilla armed conflict in a country, besides having a disaster or an armed conflict could be the consequence or the output of another disaster or armed conflict. In a chapter of the United Nations of International Law that was approved by the General Assembly back in 2016, that document was worded by a special Colombian rapporteur called Valencia Ospina. That rapporteur worded a sequence of articles and sections that can constitute the baseline or the frame of the international legislation to protect people amidst international crisis and guerrillas or armed conflict. He mentions as a rapporteur the problems that can coexist with international law in regards to that type of situations or causes. So in that instrument or international legislation in armed conflict, so what should prevail is humanitarian law above any other fields of law, because that humanitarian law is protecting that core, then that initial core, the right to live, the right to survive amidst armed conflict, that our people have that right. So we have the humanitarian international law that's enforced, and we can implement human rights protection that are always enforceable during peace times, during war times.
Gracias.
Thank you very much.
Otro comentario.
Further comments? Well,
Sí, no, adelante. Sí, adelante,
please
Mireya.
go ahead, Mireya. Yes, in correlation and, and following up on the comments of Mr. Nelio Mollar, amidst situations of conflict, what's enforced is humanitarian international law. However, so we should try to also study human rights in correlation, and more than just an analysis of emergency or disaster conditions. And I'll share a chapter about how did international human law and human rights started. Well, it all started back at the end of the Second World War. Back at the end, Mexico was part, and Mexico participated with a battalion, 101 battalion from the army. But back then, when international law was led us to really draft the morals, principles, and guarantees. There's other books that were drafted in Mexico by Mr. Rubo Arriguel in Mexico, in which he compiles the rights of our people, the initial rights or the labor rights and social security rights of our people. Back in that timeline, after the World War, or Second World War, Mexico, as I've told you, participated in that conflict, but still worked to preserve fundamental rights of our people, of people in general. Well, thank you. Milagros, we have a question, and then we have a second question from the people here who are joining this conference in person. Milagros, well, I'll comment. The fundamental documents or books about humanitarian law is Geneva, that dates back to 49. The article is the third article, another that rules any conflict or armed conflict, to guarantee the civilians' population's rights amidst armed conflict or war. Because with the Geneva Convention, we guarantee the protection of the citizenships, and we must uphold international human law. Governments have the mandate to guarantee the population's human rights, according to what's stipulated in the body of those international conventions. Thank you, Milagros. Now we have a second question. They're going to formulate the question. We have a in-person question. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your presentation. I congratulate you all. My question is, in Mexico, Mexican norm, the Mexican standard is systematically analyzed every 5 years. So sometimes the international guidelines or the international standards do not have a term to be object of scrutiny. So my question is, even though the scrutiny of the laws, the international councils that issue those international standards, I mean, do take their time. Do you have a fast track scrutiny or analysis amidst a situation of crisis? So that scrutiny or law analysis doesn't take too much. So could we fast track the scrutiny of law so we can solve the crisis?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Abrimos micrófono.
Now the floor is open. Who would like to take the floor? The expert panel members. Well, thank you very much. Amidst the disaster situation, I mean, this is something that's been developed in the past few decades. It's something that's new. At During the late 90s or mid 90s, the law in correlation to disasters was just focused in the response mechanism amidst disasters, AIDS response mechanisms, and others. Now, in the 21st century, the analysis or worries led us to focus on the prevention stages amidst a disaster that we can prevent if possible. If we can't prevent the disaster, we should be capable of mitigating the consequences or impact. Of course, we have all been witnesses of the grievances and terrible situations that we faced in the past few years in different phenomenons or disasters that happen often, affecting many economies, many nations. These natural disasters have impacted many countries. So that leads us to really draft agile response mechanisms so we as countries can implement those mechanisms with efficacy and protect our citizens. At an international scale, there's a lot of work. There's the Sendai legislation that frames the specific objectives by 2015, 2030, or there's other councils that analyze the intermediate phases. There's a composed international forum to mitigate international disasters. There's many governments participating at that table. There's other non-government associations invited and international bodies and states, scholars and other stakeholders involved in those debate councils. And then we have the regional bodies to tackle disasters, and the nations, each country has its disaster councils or steering committees to face disasters. Those who are experts in the field or that analyze the vulnerable situations of our societies are the ones that are living amidst the disaster or amidst that context. So if you build mechanisms, you can work bottoms up, and analyze the economies or the locals that face the conditions, and the local institutions or government at a local scale know what aches the populations in those scales to determine what's impacting, and then that has to be scaled up. Go to local government analysis, regional government analysis, nations government, international institutions analysis, and international bodies scrutiny. And it is true. One of the clear advantages of analyzing the soft law instruments and that body of law, soft law is a bit more flexible. And there's the process to amend or to adjust or to modify the law are a bit more fast-tracked or faster or in correlation to any amendment that's materialized in what's enshrined in any international instrument that's binding. The process is different. Here we have some comments or reactions from our panel member, Mireya. I just want to comment and comment regarding your formulated question in correlation to the drafting of Mexico's national norms. Mexican norms are sourced or created in Mexico in a council after the USMCA was celebrated or ratified, the trade agreement was passed, and that council has to draft some standards or Mexican norms to approve or pass products of international trade. But the Mexican norms have been created and implemented in different public administration sectors. The international Mexican norms are drafted and used to be capable of expanding besides the laws and legislation of a nation. But at an international scale, in international law, the Mexican norms don't have the same implementation. But without doubt, Mexican norms are very important because those Mexican norms, after they've been worded, lead us to be very specific and define what's going to happen in all the sectors that constitute the federal apparatus. Milagros, do you have further comments? I believe that what Marcos just said was clearly crystal clear, and what our keynote speaker from the panel in Mexico, her comments were great. And in Venezuela, what we do is that we adopt international instruments and at a pace that's feasible, even if there's fast tracking mechanisms. But I know that when there's soft law international instruments, there's more flexibility in the process of amendment, adjustment, or modification of those soft law instruments. So these could then be passed and used for international legislation purposes. Thank you very much. So I think we're right on time. We're sharp. So thank you so much for attending. Thank you for your comments. We thank all the panel members for being in this streaming. We thank the author of this great book. Thank you for drafting it. We're going to show you in the screen that QR code, quick reference, and the website so you can download the links and read the instrument, read the book, check it out online. And we thank you very much for being active, for joining us, for following our streaming live and in person during our streaming. We thank you very much. We invite you to our next session. That's the Well-Being for America's seminar, the permanent seminar for welfare in Americas that will happen on the 30th of October. We're going to submit a case study about the IMSS case study of reference on that 30th of October. Thank you very much. We hope you join us then. Thank you all very much. Have a great day. Thank you so much. Salute you all.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias.